When John moved into the new house on the edge of a quiet town, he still felt as though his life was balancing on the edge of change. Behind him lay a divorce, years of steady work, and the kind of loneliness that crept into evenings no matter how tired he was. But now there was Elizabeth, his new wife, gentle and caring, a woman who seemed to bring light into even the grayest days. Elizabeth had a daughter from her first marriage, Emma. She had just turned 17, and she approached the new school year with a kind of weary detachment. John noticed quickly that the relationship between mother and daughter was complicated. Tense glances at dinner, long silences that spoke louder than words, sudden sparks of irritation that died just as quickly. For John, all of this was unfamiliar ground. The role of a stepfather didn't come with a clear guide. It wasn't something that could be signed into existence with paperwork. It was a daily effort, earning trust step by step, often from someone who didn't want to give it. The first weeks passed in caution. John remained reserved, careful not to intrude on arguments between Emma and Elizabeth, though sometimes he wanted to intervene. Instead, he kept to quiet phrases. "Maybe it's better to leave this for tomorrow. Let's try to keep calm." Most of the time, though, he simply observed two women, both strong-willed in their own ways, struggling to find common ground. Emma, for her part, was guarded. She was polite but distant. Her answers to John's questions were short, clipped. When he tried to start conversations, she would offer a polite smile that vanished quickly. John understood. To her, he was an intruder, someone who had walked in and taken space that once belonged to her family. And yet there were exceptions. On rare occasions, when he offered to help her with history homework, Emma would accept. She would spread her notebooks across the table, her serious face softening with curiosity. In those moments, John saw more than a teenager. He saw a young woman in transition, caught between self-protection and the search for belonging. Autumn settled in, the evenings growing colder. The fireplace in the living room became a constant source of comfort, its glow warming the room. John often sat there with a book, sometimes humming old tunes under his breath. Emma would pass by, pretending not to notice, though her eyes lingered a little longer than necessary. One rainy evening, when Elizabeth was working late, the house was quiet except for the crackle of firewood and the steady drumming on the windows. John made tea, then paused at the doorway. "Would you like some?" he asked. Emma hesitated, then nodded. For the first time, he noticed something in her eyes, not warmth exactly, but the absence of distance. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around steaming mugs. The conversation started with small talk, school, the weather, the books she was reading. It was unremarkable, yet John sensed it was a step forward. At one point, Emma looked down into her tea and said quietly, "Everyone thinks they know me, but they don't." Her words hung in the air, delicate and unfinished. John didn't press her. Instead, he nodded, as if to let her know that not every thought needed an immediate answer. For the first time since he had moved in, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge. Over the following weeks, the rhythm of the household shifted in small but noticeable ways. John kept to his quiet habits, but Emma seemed less guarded around him. Their conversations remained brief, but there was a new softness in her tone, an unspoken acknowledgement that he wasn't just a visitor passing through. Elizabeth noticed it too. "She talks to you more than she talks to me these days," she said one evening while they prepared dinner. There was no resentment in her voice, just weary surprise. John smiled faintly. "Maybe because I don't push." Elizabeth gave him a knowing look. "You're patient. That's good for her. She needs that." Still, patience had its challenges. Emma's moods shifted quickly, like autumn weather. Some mornings she greeted him with a casual morning, other times she passed him in silence. Earphones in, eyes fixed straight ahead. John reminded himself not to take it personally. He knew trust wasn't something given once, it had to be rebuilt every day. One Saturday afternoon, Elizabeth was away visiting her sister. The house felt quiet, filled only with the muffled sounds of rain against the roof. John found Emma in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket, her laptop resting on her knees. The glow of the screen reflected in her thoughtful eyes. "What are you watching?" he asked, lowering himself into the armchair across from her. She hesitated, then tilted the screen so he could see. "It's an old documentary about cities that disappeared." John leaned forward, intrigued. "Lost places. That's fascinating. You know, I once visited an abandoned factory back when I was younger." The silence there was almost louder than noise. Emma's lips curved slightly, the closest she had come to a smile that day. "You like strange places too?" And just like that, a conversation opened. They spent nearly an hour discussing forgotten towns, ruined castles, and the mystery of places left behind. John noticed how animated Emma became when she talked about these things. Her hands moved as she spoke, her eyes lit up. For a while, the guarded teenager vanished, replaced by a passionate storyteller. When the rain subsided and the room grew dim, Emma closed her laptop. "Most people think it's depressing. I don't. I think it's beautiful. Like every broken place still holds a secret." John studied her expression. She wasn't just talking about ruins, he realized. There was something in her words that hinted at herself, a quiet metaphor hidden behind her fascination. He didn't say it aloud, but the thought lingered. Emma was describing more than abandoned cities. She was describing the way she felt inside. That evening, after Elizabeth returned, Emma retreated to her room with her usual silence. John stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing cups, when Elizabeth asked, "Did she behave?" John gave a small laugh. "Better than that. She talked." Elizabeth raised her eyebrows. "Really? Really? She's smart. You don't always see it, but it's there." Elizabeth sighed, drying her hands. "She hides it from me. Always has. Sometimes I don't know how to reach her anymore." John didn't answer right away. He thought of Emma's words about broken places that still held secrets. "Maybe," he said finally, "she just needs someone to sit with her in the silence." The following week confirmed this thought. Emma began joining him in the living room in the evenings, sometimes with her laptop, sometimes with a book. They didn't always speak, sometimes she simply sat near the fire while he read. But the silence was different now, less of a barrier and more of a shared space. One evening, as the firelight flickered, Emma asked quietly, "Do you ever regret starting over?" The question caught John off guard. He looked at her, at the way her gaze was fixed on the flames rather than on him. "You mean marrying again?" She nodded. John took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "No, not for a second. Starting over isn't failure. It's survival. It's giving yourself another chance." Emma was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, almost in a whisper, "I wonder if I'll ever get that chance." John turned toward her, but she didn't meet his eyes. He didn't press her, didn't ask what she meant. Instead, he let the fire crackle between them, holding the weight of her words gently, as if silence itself could be a form of understanding. That night, long after Emma had gone upstairs, John found himself staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. Something about the way she had spoken stayed with him. Beneath her sharp edges and silences, there was a depth of longing he hadn't fully seen before. And in that moment, he realized he wasn't just living in a house with a teenager who happened to be his stepdaughter. He was standing at the threshold of something fragile, a trust that was being offered piece by piece, if only he had the patience to protect it. Winter crept in quietly. The days shortened, the wind sharpened, and the house became a refuge from the chill outside. John found that the rhythm of life under one roof was changing again, almost imperceptibly. Emma no longer avoided him. She didn't seek him out either, not openly, but she no longer disappeared behind her bedroom door the moment she came home. Instead, she lingered. Sometimes she sat in the kitchen while he cooked, scrolling through her phone in silence. Sometimes she carried her homework into the living room, settling onto the floor near the fire instead of working alone upstairs. These were small things, but John noticed them. They carried a quiet weight, a signal of trust growing in fragile increments. One evening in December, Elizabeth had to attend a late meeting. The snow had begun to fall thick and heavy outside, cloaking the neighborhood in silence. Emma came downstairs with a blanket draped around her shoulders and stood in the doorway of the living room. "Fire's going?" she asked, nodding toward the fireplace. John closed his book and smiled. "Just lit it. Wanna sit?" She hesitated, then curled into the far end of the couch. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the usual guardedness in her expression. For a long while, neither of them spoke. John returned to his book, but he didn't really read. He was aware of her presence in a way that was difficult to put into words. Eventually, Emma broke the silence. "You don't talk much, do you?" John looked up, amused. "That's a complaint?" She shook her head. "No, just different. Most people either ignore me or try too hard. You don't do either." John set the book aside. "Maybe I'm just learning. It's not always about saying the right thing. Sometimes it's about being there when someone needs to talk." Emma studied him for a moment, as though weighing whether to believe him. Then she said softly, "You're not what I expected." The words hung between them, their meaning deliberately vague. John didn't ask her to explain. Some thoughts, he had learned, were best left unfinished. Christmas arrived with its usual chaos of lights, cooking, and visits from neighbors. Elizabeth was radiant during the festivities, happy to see her family coming together, at least on the surface. Emma participated, though with her usual restraint, smiling politely when spoken to but withdrawing quickly once the noise grew too much. On Christmas Eve, after the guests had gone, John found Emma standing by the window in the darkened living room, the glow of the streetlights painting her silhouette against the glass. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked gently. She shrugged, not turning from the window. "Too loud in my head." John walked over, stopping a few steps behind her. "I know that feeling." For a moment she didn't reply. Then, in a voice barely audible, she said, "Sometimes I feel like I don't belong anywhere. Not here, not at school, not even with Mom." The honesty of it struck him. It wasn't a complaint, not exactly, more of a confession. "You belong more than you think," John said quietly. Emma turned her head slightly, enough for him to see the faintest trace of a smile. "You really believe that?" "I do." She looked back out the window, but the sharpness in her shoulders seemed to ease. And for John, that was enough. The months that followed brought even more subtle shifts. Emma began asking him questions about his work, about his past, about books he had read. Sometimes they debated over small things, like which movie was worth watching or whether winter nights were more peaceful than summer mornings. Other times, their conversations wandered into deeper territory. One night, as they washed dishes together, Emma asked, "When you were my age, did you ever feel invisible?" John chuckled softly. "All the time. It's part of being 17. You're not a kid anymore, but you're not quite an adult either. People don't know how to see you." Emma nodded slowly, staring at the soapy water. "That's exactly it." The way she said it made John realize how much weight the word carried for her. Invisible. It wasn't just about being overlooked, it was about being misunderstood. "You're not invisible to me," he said before he could stop himself. Emma looked at him, startled. Then her expression softened, and she gave the smallest nod, as though the words had landed somewhere deep. By February, their bond had become undeniable, though unspoken. Elizabeth saw it too, though she seemed more relieved than concerned. "You've been good for her," she told John one evening. "She trusts you." "That's more than I ever managed at her age." John didn't reply. He thought of Emma's quiet confessions, her hidden smiles, the way she had begun to linger in his presence. Trust, yes, but also something fragile and undefined, something that carried both promise and risk. One snowy night, Emma left her bedroom door open for the first time since John had moved in. It was a small thing, almost accidental, but John noticed. He passed by quietly, resisting the urge to say anything. Some walls, he knew, were best left to fall on their own. And as he lay awake later, listening to the wind against the windows, he realized that the distance between them, once so wide, so impassable, was slowly, almost invisibly, beginning to close. March arrived with thawing snow and restless winds. The streets turned muddy, the trees stood bare, waiting for the first signs of green. Inside the house, however, warmth had begun to settle in, not just from the fireplace, but from the growing sense of ease between John and Emma. Elizabeth often remarked on it. "She's softer around you," she said one morning over coffee. "I don't know how you did it, but you've reached her in a way I couldn't." John only shrugged. He didn't want to claim credit for something so delicate. Trust wasn't something you won, it was something given, freely and quietly, like a secret passed from one hand to another. On a Friday evening, Elizabeth was away on a weekend business trip, leaving John and Emma alone in the house. Emma had ordered pizza, and they sat at the kitchen table, the box open between them. It was the first time John had seen her laugh so openly. "You put pineapple on yours?" she teased, raising an eyebrow. "Don't knock it until you've tried it," John countered, grinning. Emma shook her head in mock disgust. "That's a crime against pizza." For the next hour, the kitchen filled with laughter, easy conversation, and the sound of clinking glasses. It was ordinary pizza, soda, and small talk, yet John felt something shift. The air between them carried no trace of awkwardness. It felt natural, even comfortable. Later that night, they moved to the living room. The fire was lit, and Emma had brought down a blanket, curling up at one end of the couch. John sat at the other, a book in his hand. The room was quiet except for the sound of the flames and the occasional rustle of pages. At some point, Emma set her phone aside and asked, "Do you ever feel like people see only what they want to see in you?" John closed his book slowly. "All the time. Most people look at others through their own needs, not who the person actually is." Emma's gaze lingered on him. "So, if someone really sees you, that means something, right?" "Yes," John said, his voice low. "It means everything." She didn't reply, but the look in her eyes was steady, thoughtful. Spring crept closer. Emma began spending more evenings downstairs instead of in her room. Sometimes she brought her homework, sometimes a sketch pad. John discovered she had a talent for drawing. One evening, he found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, a notebook balanced on her knees, sketching the outline of the fireplace. "That's good," he said, watching over her shoulder. She gave a small smile. "It's just practice." "Even practice can be beautiful," John replied. Her pencil paused for a moment, as if the words had touched something inside her, before she continued. One Sunday afternoon, Elizabeth suggested they all go for a walk in the park. The paths were still damp from melted snow, and the air smelled of earth and thawing leaves. John walked beside Elizabeth, while Emma drifted a few steps ahead, earphones dangling, but not playing anything. At one point, Elizabeth slowed down to answer a call, leaving John and Emma walking side by side. Emma glanced at him. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think this was temporary." that you'd be gone in a year. John kept his eyes on the path. And now? She hesitated, then murmured, "Now I don't want you to be." The words were simple, but John felt their weight. It wasn't just acceptance, it was something more, something tender, fragile, and unspoken. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, trusting she would feel his understanding without needing him to spell it out. By late April, the house had changed in ways Elizabeth never questioned. She was relieved to see Emma lighter, more open, more alive. She often attributed it to Emma growing out of her moods. John knew better. He had seen the quiet unfolding, the small moments that built into something deeper. One evening, after Elizabeth had gone to bed, Emma stayed in the living room with John, sketching by the glow of the fire. At some point, she looked up from her notebook. "You're different when it's just us," she said softly. John met her gaze, curious. "Different how?" She hesitated, her pencil hovering above the page. "You listen more. You look at me like I matter." John's chest tightened. He set his book aside, choosing his response carefully. "You do matter, Emma. More than you know." Her eyes lingered on his, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. Then she looked back down at her sketch, cheeks faintly flushed. The silence between them wasn't awkward this time. It was charged with something unspoken, something both of them felt, but neither dared to name. That night, as John turned out the lights and climbed the stairs, he realized just how close they had become. The distance that once felt impossible had narrowed into something intimate, something fragile. And though no words had been spoken aloud, he knew a line had been crossed, not with action, but with understanding. A line that, once crossed, could never be fully erased. May arrived, and with it came the scent of blossoms drifting through open windows. The house felt different now, less like a place where three people lived together by circumstance, and more like a home stitched together by choice. Elizabeth noticed the peace that had settled into Emma. She was less combative, more present. At dinner, she occasionally joined conversations instead of retreating behind silence. To Elizabeth, it seemed like her daughter had simply grown out of her darker moods. To John, it was something else entirely, the result of months of patience, listening, and quiet recognition. One evening, the three of them sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the trees. Elizabeth leaned into John's shoulder, her voice soft. "I'm glad we're all finally finding our balance." John nodded, though his gaze drifted toward Emma, who sat a few steps away, sketchpad resting on her knees. She caught his glance, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met in silent understanding. No words were exchanged, but everything that needed to be said passed in that look. Summer followed quickly. Days grew long and bright, and Emma often spent hours outside, sketching in the garden or reading on the porch. Sometimes John joined her, sitting quietly with his own book. Sometimes they talked. Other times, silence was enough. One afternoon, as they sat side by side under the shade of the oak tree, Emma closed her sketchpad and asked, "Do you think people ever really understand each other?" John thought for a moment before replying. "Not always. But sometimes, if you're lucky, you find someone who sees you more clearly than you see yourself." Emma gave him a small, almost wistful smile. "That's rare." "Yes," John agreed, meeting her gaze. "Rare, and worth holding on to." She looked at him for a long moment, then returned her attention to her sketchpad, though her smile lingered. As the months passed, the fragile thread between them strengthened, not with dramatic gestures, but with steady, quiet presence. They shared books, late-night conversations, and long walks when Elizabeth was busy. There were no declarations, no promises spoken aloud, only the unspoken knowledge that something had changed between them forever. John sometimes wondered where it would all lead. But he knew better than to demand answers from something so delicate. Emma was young, still finding her place in the world. His role was not to define her path, but to stand beside her as she discovered it. And so he kept his place, not as a father she never wanted, nor as a stranger she couldn't trust, but as something in between, something unnamed yet essential. The story of their bond never needed to be told in dramatic moments. It existed in glances, in shared silences, in the subtle ways Emma's guarded heart began to open. It was a connection built on patience, recognition, and the rare gift of being seen. And though life would surely bring change, years, choices, separations, and new beginnings, John knew that what they had built would remain. Not a fairy tale, not something forbidden, but a fragile truth. Two lives, once strangers, had found each other in the quiet spaces of a shared home. And in that quiet, they had both been changed.